Well, good afternoon, everyone. Today is Sabbath, March 12th, 2022. And I want to welcome you to this Bible study today. And today we're going to touch upon a topic uh, that's not always kind of a favorite of people, right? But it's something that I think it's a little bit more, I wouldn't say abstract, but a little bit more um, theoretical in nature, but it is very relevant to our walk with Almighty Yahweh, and that's specifically the topic of circumcision. Again, it's not the most fun of topics for people, right? But there are spiritual aspects regarding circumcision that I think are important for us to understand, and that tie in to many of the things that we've spoken about in the past several months, particularly as we went through the book of Romans, as we went through the book of Galatians, as we discussed concepts like the works of the law that we're also going to touch upon today. And as we've talked about what it means to draw nearer to Almighty Yahweh in such a way that we are serving him from the heart. So we're going to touch upon many scriptures today, and we're going to try to coordinate various scriptures to help us better understand this topic and what it means to us in the practical nature of things. So without further ado, let's turn over to the book of Philippians, and I will bring that up on screen. Okay, so we're going to begin in Philippians 3, and we'll start with chapter 1. With chapter 3, verse 1. Philippians 3, 1. Finally, my brethren, rejoice in Yahweh. To write the same things again is no trouble to me, and it is a safeguard for you. Beware of the dogs, beware of the evil workers, beware of the false circumcision. For we are the true circumcision, who worship in the spirit of Yahweh and glory in Messiah Yahshua, and put no confidence in the flesh, although I myself might have confidence even in the flesh. If anyone else has a mind to put confidence in the flesh, I far more. Circumcised the 8th day, of the nation of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the assembly, as to the righteousness which is in the Torah, found blameless. But whatever things were gained to me, those things I have counted as loss for the sake of Messiah. More than that, I count all things to be loss in view of the surpassing value of knowing Messiah, Yahshua, my master, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and count them but rubbish, so that I may gain Messiah and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own derived from the law, or derived from law, but that which is through faith in Messiah, the righteousness which is from Elohim on the basis of faith, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death, in order that I may attain to the resurrection from the dead. So, as I've explained in the past when we've gone through the epistle to the Philippians, Paul is defending himself from a group of people who have been trying to influence the brothers and sisters in Philippi, in Macedonia, with regard to Paul's credentials and things that he's been teaching. And he brings up a defense of himself here in this chapter. And one of the things that he says quite emphatically is that, look, if anyone wants to boast about being a Jew, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing here, right? If anyone wants to boast about being a Jew, no one can do that more than I, right? Because I'm a Jew of Jews, tribe of Benjamin, a Pharisee, right? By implication, he's saying I'm a person who observes the law flawlessly, right? And because of all this, if I wanted to, I could, anything that they claim about themselves that gives them credibility, I can do it that much more. But the thing I'm really drawing attention to here is this concept of him being circumcised on the 8th day of the nation of Israel, but yet he's not putting any confidence in the flesh. In other words, I'm not putting confidence. If anyone wants to put confidence in the flesh, in other words, that in the flesh, I'm a Jew, I can do that, but I don't put so much attention to that. I put more attention to the fact that I'm a servant of Yahweh and faithful to Yahweh. And that's evidenced by all the things that I'm teaching, all the things that I'm doing. And but I also could claim the physical nature of it all as well. Why do I start with this passage? Well, because much of what I'm going to speak to today has and the topic, by the way, is what is the real meaning of circumcision? What is the real meaning of circumcision? And much of what I'm going to speak about involves the physical concept of circumcision and the customs that revolve around circumcision, and how people have used that in the past. And even to this day, some people use that as a means of drawing distinctions that necessarily shouldn't be drawn. And more importantly, I want us to understand that the important circumcision that for all of us, male or female, right? Because interestingly enough, there's no obviously female circumcision in a physical sense. So what's that all about? What is the whole importance of the doctrine of circumcision, or not the doctrine, but the notion of circumcision? It's not necessarily a doctrine, but what is the purpose of circumcision, and what does that have to do from a spiritual perspective, which is the more important thing that we need to speak about and that we need to realize today. And we're going to go to a number of passages to better understand that. And I think I'm going to have some information that hopefully will be of interest to you, that will shed some light in some of the things that you'd see, for example, in the book of Galatians in particular, and also in the book of Romans, and indeed that shed light upon Paul's understanding of the Torah and Paul's understanding of our role, whether Jew or Gentile, in the faith, and try to put all those things together over the next hour and 15 minutes or so. Okay, so going from Philippians 3, 1 to 11, I want to, like as I said, I want to share quite a number of scriptures with you, and we're only gonna, as usual, we're just gonna scratch the surface, right? But let's start out over in Genesis 17, where the commandment for circumcision is actually given to Abraham. This is the first time that we see it. Genesis 17, and we'll begin reading with verse 9. And the context, of course, is that Yahweh, and actually I want to start from the beginning because I think it's important to understand this. Let's actually begin with Genesis 17, verse 1. It says, "Now when Abram was 99 years old, Yahweh appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly." So if you look at that word blameless, and you look at the definition down lower left, you see the word is tamim. The word tamim is a word that has to do with wholeness, with integrity. Okay, so if you remember, it's also the word from which you get the term perfection, right? So if you think about the Urim and the Thummim part of it, it comes from this word, from the word tamim. Okay, so a loose translation of Urim and Thummim. What are the Urim and Thummim? Well, that's described in the book of Exodus when we're talking about the breastplate and other elements for the priesthood. The Urim and Thummim were two stones that were used by the priest in order to learn Yahweh's decision on a particular matter. And you see David calling the priest over, for example, to inquire of Yahweh. And the priest would use the Urim and Thummim quite kind of for yes or no responses. Maybe it was a little bit more than that, but typically yes or no type responses on whether they should do this or that or the other thing, right? It's deeper than that, but generally speaking, in the physical sense, that's what they were. But the interesting thing is that the translation, the loose translation of Urim and Thummim are lights and perfections, right? So the Thummim part comes up is that from that perfections thing, or Urim is the lights, is similar to what you see in Genesis in the first chapter where it says Yahweh said, "Let there be light," Yehi or, the word or, and then the plural of that is Urim. So Urim and Urim, Thummim, lights and perfections. And perfection has to do with integrity, has to do with being whole. So if you think about the word integrity is the same word from which we get the word integer in mathematics. So in mathematics, you're going to have a whole integer or you're going to have a fraction, right? So the word integer means that it is a whole number. So the word tumim, that sense of integrity, if something has integrity, it is whole, it is blameless, right? And why am I taking so much time to explain this? Well, because this has a lot to do with this concept that we're going to be talking about today with circumcision. Because just to give you a little preview, to be circumcised has much more to do with just a physical act that is done to male children on the 8th day, according to the covenant that we're going to see described here and elsewhere. The physical circumcision that is done to a male is representative of something that is spiritual in nature, which has to do with integrity, of heart, right? So I'll talk more about that. But it's interesting that he begins this chapter, which is why I say I want to introduce this chapter going to the very beginning for context, because it has to do with everything that we're going to speak about. So he's Yahweh, he's El Shaddai, and he says, walk before me. In other words, walk is not just physically walking. That's not really what's being implied here. Walk before me is more in the sense of live your life before me and do so in a way that's blameless, right? I will establish my covenant between me and you. In other words, because you will walk with me in a way that is blameless, you will walk, and blameless, I'm not really crazy about that translation. I like it more to say, and be a person of integrity, right? Walk before me in a manner that is whole. If you're a person who has integrity, that means that you're complete, and I don't like the term perfect either, but the term perfect implies a wholeness, right? Blameless also implies a wholeness. In other words, the idea being that your mind, and therefore the metaphor of your heart, you're not divided. You do not have divided loyalties. You're not, thinking this way towards Yahweh here, and then you just do whatever you want there. If you have integrity with your wife, if you're married to someone, you're not with her a certain way with her, and then privately you go find ways to do other things with somebody else, right? That's not integrity. So the person who has integrity is a person that is complete, that is put together. That's what the word means, right? The term means someone who doesn't have divided loyalty. So when you look at the Shema and it says to love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, all your mind, and all your soul, that's pretty comprehensive, right? And what that means is that love Yahweh with all your mind, all your heart, all your soul. If you're worshiping Yahweh with all of it, then what does that not leave room for? Anything else, right? So that's the idea behind integrity. That's the idea behind that. And this is ultimately what circumcision is going to represent. It's going to represent that, right? I will establish my covenant, and look at the result of living a life walking before Yahweh with integrity, with wholeness. It results in a life, first of all, it results in being in covenant with Almighty Yahweh. And when you think about that in terms of the New Testament, and you think about something like Romans, if you recall, that whole concept of justification means being declared righteous in covenant relationship with Yahweh. You see how it's all interconnected. I'll come back to some of that a little bit later. And I will multiply you exceedingly. Abram fell on his face, and Elohim talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Avraham, which means father of multitudes. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations, for an everlasting covenant. It means it will never end. To be Elohim to you and to your descendants after you. And by the way, again, those descendants are going to involve not just looking way ahead, not just Israel, not just the Jewish people, but it's going to involve all the nations, right? I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. Back down to verse 7, an everlasting covenant to be Elohim to you and to your descendants after you. I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their Elohim. And then let's just briefly, we'll come back to 19, but let's just briefly go over to Genesis 12, which is when Yahweh first starts speaking to Abraham and setting forth Abraham's course or direction in life. So in Genesis 12, this is what Yahweh tells him. Now Yahweh said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you, Abraham, in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. All the families of the earth will be blessed. And this was 22 years before this encounter with in Genesis 17. Okay, so let's go back to Genesis 17. So all the nations in Abraham will be blessed. So the things that we see, and where am I heading with this? What I'm heading to is what you see over in the book of Galatians, where now Yahshua has come, and Yahshua is the model example of righteousness. And in Yahshua and in belief in him and through our faith in him, we have an opportunity for salvation. We who? The Jews? Yes. Who else? Everyone. The nations, right? Fulfillment of what Yahweh promised Abram, right? And later, as he was called, Abraham. So we'll come back to that as we look into Galatians a little bit later. So let's go back to Genesis 17 and continue reading verse 9. Elohim said further to Abraham, now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep. Between me and your descendants after you, every male among you shall be circumcised. Now I want you to understand, and I'm not going to go through every single verse, just take my word for it. And if you want to see them later, you can ask me. But the covenant itself is not circumcision. People sometimes confuse that. They think that the covenant is circumcision. Circumcision is not the covenant. Circumcision is the sign of the covenant. It's just that the way that the wording appears here, it doesn't make that entirely clear. But the covenant itself is everything behind the circumcision. Circumcision is itself is the sign of the covenant, not the covenant itself. And you shall be, so circumcision is representing here the whole covenant. And as a matter of fact, that also plays into something I'm going to be talking about later, because the concept of circumcision represents everything associated with circumcision. Okay. So we'll come back. And you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between, there it is, right? This is the explanation here. It's like, it's kind of similar to in Exodus 3:15, when Yahweh asks Moses his name, and he first gives him, he says, I am that I am. He gives him the explanation of it, and then he says, my name is Yahweh. So if you read that and you're not reading the whole thing in context, you think, oh, my name is I am. It's not. His name is Yahweh, which is a derivative of the verb I am, but he gives the explanation first. So this is similar to what's happening here. He says, this is my covenant. And then he says, okay, this is going to be the sign of the covenant, right? You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. And every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. A servant who was born in the house or who was bought with money from any foreigner, that's a slave, a servant, right? Remember, we talked about the difference between the word slave and the word servant. So I much prefer the word servant, which is in italics here, but that's what it is. A servant who was born in the house or who was bought with money from any foreigner who is not of your descendants. A servant who is born in your house or who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. Thus shall my covenant be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. But an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So it's a very serious thing, right? This is a very serious thing. And there are many places where you see this described, and someone who is being brought into the covenant must be circumcised. Okay, and the males. Now it's interesting. Obviously, there's no circumcision for a female for obvious reasons, right? But so what people have traditionally looked at as sort of a representative act by females has been the mikvah, right? Which is a baptism, which is a form of baptism, has similar connotations to it, but it's not given in the same way as circumcision. So circumcision represents it for men, but remember that, of course, in the ancient world, men are an extension of their families, including the females in their families. So therefore, in describing the male as being circumcised, it really extends to the entire household. Okay, so women are covered under this, although not in the physical sense, quite obviously. Okay, so where does all this lead? Well, let's talk a little bit more. Let's go over to Exodus 12, and we'll begin reading with verse 43. You might recall that around Passover time, no foreigner could eat of the Passover, right? Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, this is Exodus 12, verse 43, this is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner is to eat of it. And that term, foreigner, is the nachar. No foreigner is to eat of it, but every man's slave, there's a concept of the slave or the servant again, every man's slave purchased with money, and the word is eved, from which we get the word Obadiah, or servant. But every man's eved purchased with money, after you have circumcised him, then he may eat of it. A sojourner or a hired servant shall not eat of it. It is to be eaten in a single house. You are not to bring, and by the way, notice, a sojourner, which is the stranger, or a hired servant, as compared to a servant who's born in your household, shall not eat of it, because presumably they're not invested in the same way in Israel as the person who's born in the household. It is to be eaten in a single house. You are not to bring forth any of the flesh outside of the house, nor are you to break any bone of it. All the congregation of Israel are to celebrate this. But if a stranger sojourns with you, that's the ger, and celebrates the Passover to Yahweh, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near to celebrate it. And he shall be like a native of the land. Notice that. But no uncircumcised person may eat of it. The same law shall apply to the native as to the stranger, as to the ger who sojourns among you. And that is a whole study in and of itself, the homeborn as compared to the stranger, the ger, what's called the ger, who's sojourning among you. And it's an interesting study to go into the differences between the homeborn and the stranger, the ger, the slave, the hired servant who's born within the household, and the servant who's born within the household, and the hired servant who is not and doesn't be part of the household. And then the question becomes, okay, if they're circumcised, does that make them part of Israel, or does that just allow them to do certain things without embracing the entirety of the covenant? That's another question altogether, which we really won't get into today, except peripherally. But the bottom line is that nothing with regard to doing things together with Israel could be done of importance, especially with regard to the Passover and key festivals and the like, without the person being circumcised. So what's happening there? Well, what's happening is that the person has to have what circumcision represents, right? Which is a heart prepared to serve Yahweh. Circumcision has to do with making a break for the people who are not born into it, making a break from the worldly ways of thinking, the secular ways of thinking, the foreign ways of thinking. Maybe the foreign way is more accurate to describe, because what? No foreigner is to eat of it. So the idea is that someone who is foreign to the ways of Yahweh is not to eat of it. And if they want to partake of it, they have to become circumcised, because then it requires something of them. And the requirement of them is that their heart be drawn to Yahweh in a way that is genuine and that is authentic. Who is going to be, let me ask you, who is going to be, we're talking about men here, right? And I don't need to go into detail about what circumcision is. I'm sure you all know that. I don't need to be graphic about that, right? But who, especially presumably males who are grown, adult males, who among them is going to engage in circumcision without having a need to, right? Without having a true desire to do that? No one. So it's asking a lot of someone to be circumcised, which means presumably only the people who are the most serious are going to do that, because otherwise, why in the world would they do something like that, right? So circumcision is something that is representing a symbolic gesture of something that's much deeper than just a physical act that is being done. So let's. I said I want to describe it graphically, but let me just describe in general terms something about circumcision that, and then draw a spiritual teaching from that. So circumcision, of course, is removing the foreskin at 8 days in the context of the commandment. 8 days after. Let me go back to Genesis 17, verse 12, right? Every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. Okay, so and of course, among the Jews, there's a whole ritual that goes along with that now that's not described here in Genesis. But the male member, right, is covered by foreskin at birth, and then a removal of that foreskin is obviously, it's a very personal, it's a very intimate experience. And it's meant to be that way, right? There's a certain amount of pain involved in that, obviously. And it's something that it makes a deep impression on the child. The child probably doesn't remember it later, interestingly enough, but they're certainly going to know it when it happens, right? And the parents will know it as well because they're going to witness it, okay? And it's interesting because when you think about this experience that is so very intimate, there's obviously more going on than meets the eye with regard to this act. There's a pastor by the name of Jack Hayford, Hayford, who has written a bit about circumcision. And he says something along these lines, and I'll just kind of paraphrase here. He talks about circumcision touching upon the very identity of a man and what defines him. And remember that as I describe these things in terms of men, understand that from a spiritual perspective, that we're including women in that as well. But circumcision touches upon the very identity of a man. It's in effect what defines him. It's imprinted in his skin, literally, beginning with the 8th day, right? So this very personal, this very intimate thing, no one sees this but Yahweh himself, right? And the person no one who sees this who wants to, so Yahweh sees this, and of course the parents, right? But the idea is that this act is done to this individual, and Yahweh is the one who sees this, who wants to communicate to us a process that affects our most secret and private parts. So the idea is in the same manner that there is a physical surgery taking place on the foreskin, which is what it is. It's a surgical procedure. In the same way that there's this physical surgery taking place in the foreskin, Yahweh also, from a spiritual perspective, he touches us in a profound, personal way. And then in terms of the spiritual sense, now obviously a child, the parallel is not there because the child doesn't voluntarily submit to anything. They don't remember anything, right? They're 8 days old, literally, okay? But in the spiritual sense, if we agree to circumcise our hearts by us agreeing to and voluntarily allowing someone to perform that spiritual surgery, to allow Yahweh to perform that spiritual surgery on our hearts, it in effect symbolizes a willingness for us to make ourselves vulnerable to Yahweh, to allow him to perform that spiritual surgery on our hearts. And you see many parallels throughout the scripture. You see, you see instances that we don't have time to go through every last example, but instances of circumcision where something about that nature, of that personal nature, is taking place, and it's even used inappropriately. For example, the sons of Jacob, who, when their sister is raped by the Shechemites, they add insult to injury to them because they force them, in effect, to get circumcised. And then the very act that they're not doing out of authenticity, right? Because they're doing it because, the son wants the girl, so they're doing it for the wrong reasons, but they agree to it anyway. And yet there's this implication that it's not sincere, that it's done for a motive that, because they didn't have to agree to it, right? But because he wanted the girl, they all agree to it. And then they wind up losing their lives for it because the sons of Jacob wind up being treacherous against them, and they kill them. This is over in Genesis 34. So it's something that it's almost as if really what they've done is they've taken something that involves the most intimate, deepest covenant, and they've used it to teach them a lesson that they pay for with their lives. It's almost, like I said, adding insult to injury, right? Where, and I'm understating that, of course, because they killed them. It's like you're saying this is something that only the most committed Israelites would do, and you're because you have defiled a daughter of Israel, you don't understand what's happening with the circumcision, but we do. They didn't say this, of course, but it's the implication is there. We understand that we're going to force you to become, to take the deepest thing for an Israelite, but because we know that you don't deserve it, we're going to wind up killing you all. Now we can debate from here to tomorrow about the ethics of that, and we know that there's plenty wrong with that whole situation. No matter what their intention was towards Dinah, the way in which they carried that out was pretty treacherous, and there's all sorts of negative connotations there. But my point is that they took something that to them was incredibly meaningful, and they used it to teach them a lesson and to turn it upside its head. It just goes to show the level of intimacy with which they viewed circumcision, to the point that they would use it in such a manner. So I want to read something to you I'm going to be reading from different sources today. And I'm going to read to you from what's called an excursus from the Jewish Publication Society Torah commentary on Genesis. And I'm just going to read you a little bit. An excursus is kind of like a little journey they take away from the main article and the main commentary, and they give you a little, they take a particular topic and then they expand upon that topic a little bit. That's the excursus. And this is the excursus on, on circumcision. I just want to give you some more insights about circumcision so that you can keep everything in context. So this is excursus 12 on circumcision, and it says, in those cultures that traditionally practice circumcision, the age at which it is performed may vary widely, but the overwhelming preference is at puberty or as a prenuptial rite. In either case, it takes place at a crucial period in the male life cycle and marks the initiation of the individual into the common life of the group. The biblical shift to the 8th day after birth is a radical break with existing tradition, severing all connection with puberty, marriage, and rites of passage. This particular dissociation now permits circumcision to be invested with an entirely new and original meaning. The operation owes its sanction not to any natural reason, but solely to its being, and they say, divinely ordained. In the course of its performance, it derives its significance solely from its being the conscious expression of the external immutable. Immutable means it's immovable, it's you can't change it. Between Elohim and Abraham, having been performed, it constitutes the ineradicable token. What is ineradicable? It means that you can't erase it, right? The ineradicable, literally, you can't reverse it, although they tried to do that too. I'll tell you about that later. It constitutes the ineradicable, the unerasable token of the imposition of that covenant upon every generation of his descendants. The religious life of the Jew begins, therefore, on the 8th day of his birth. Since the circumcision is performed on each individual at that age and is not, as it is frequently elsewhere, a ritual practiced collectively, it's individual in nature, right? It underscores the singularity of each Jew's relationship to Yahweh, his personal dedication and obligation as a member of a covenanted community. It is the distinguishing mark of Jewish identity, and more than anything else, has proved to be a powerfully cohesive force in the struggle for national survival. Pretty strong words, but I love the idea of the nature of this individualistic purpose here. That means that you can't separate it from each individual. And the reason why that's so impressive to me is because when you consider, as we will in looking at various verses, that circumcision of the foreskin is not the main issue, right? It's the circumcision of the heart. It constitutes an individual commitment of each individual, male and female, to the covenant. It is a very personal thing, a very intimate thing. And this is what I'm getting at in general, right? I said that I would mention that some try to reverse circumcision. If you were a Greek pagan participating in the games later in history, one could see and clearly identify the uncircumcised male members and clearly distinguish between a Greek and a Jew. And then when Hellenization took place, in other words, the attempt to impose Greek philosophy and Greek culture upon the Jews, many Jews tried to reverse that. There was a surgery called epispasm where they tried to reverse the circumcision procedure. I won't describe that, and it didn't go over well. And to me, I get a lesson from that too, right? If you're a person who wants to fit in, and a person who is making an attempt to fit in by reversing that circumcision, it usually ends up pretty ugly, right? Because you're not fooling anyone. You don't fool the people whom you're trying to assimilate, but neither do you fool Almighty Yahweh, who has seen that specific act upon you at one point in your life. So it's very interesting. And this is something personal, as I said, that it's like the tzitzit that no one else is supposed to see. It's a sign between you and Yahweh, right? So let's go over to some other verses here and start getting in and give you an extension of this with regard to the spiritual aspects of circumcision. So let's turn over to Deuteronomy, and we'll go over to Deuteronomy 10, beginning with verse 12. Now, Israel, what does Yahweh your Elohim require from you? Doesn't that sound a lot like what we read over in Micah? What does Yahweh, remember, Micah probably got it from this, right? To walk in his ways, right? So the prophets were and I'll just put an aside here, the prophets were the promoters of the Torah. They were the guardians of the Torah. So it's no surprise that Micah would have taken the words more than likely straight out of Deuteronomy 10 and then put his own spin on them to make what he wrote in Micah. Now, Israel, what does Yahweh your Elohim require from you? But to fear Yahweh your Elohim, to walk in all his ways and love him, and to serve Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and with all your soul. It's a description of what? Of a very intimate relationship, an intimate covenant relationship with Yahweh. And to keep Yahweh's commandments, this covenant, and his statutes, which I'm commanding you today for your good. Behold, to Yahweh your Elohim belong heaven and the highest heavens, the earth and all that is in it. Yet on your fathers did Yahweh set his affection to love them, and he chose their descendants after them, even you above all peoples, as it is this day. And then key here is verse 16. So do what? Circumcise your heart and stiffen your neck no longer. Circumcise your heart and stiffen your neck no longer. That's a weird expression. What does that mean, to circumcise your heart? For Yahweh your Elohim is the Elohim of all and master, sovereign of all, the great, the mighty, and the awesome Elohim, who does not show partiality nor take a bribe. He executes justice for the orphan and the widow and shows his love for the stranger by giving him food and clothing. So show your love for the alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall fear Yahweh your Elohim. That's where it starts. You shall reverence, you shall fear him. You shall fear Yahweh your Elohim. You shall serve him and cling to him, and you shall swear by his name. He is your praise, and he is your Elohim, who has done these great and awesome things for you, which your eyes have seen. Your fathers went down to Egypt, 70 persons in all, and now Yahweh your Elohim has made you as numerous as the stars of heaven. So we're seeing here already fulfillment of what Yahweh promised to Abraham. You see how it all kind of hooks together? So the heart of this year, no pun intended, is to circumcise your heart and stiffen your neck no longer. Well, what does it mean to stiffen your neck? Well, stiffen your neck, you see that in many places about how Israel was a stiff-necked people, right? It means stubborn, right? To become stubborn, it's like you won't bend, right? You're not going to turn your neck because you won't bend. Well, the concept goes together. To circumcise your heart and to avoid stiffening your neck means that your heart is soft, right? It means that you're not stubborn. It means that your heart is pliable, your heart is bendable. And there are many allusions to this in Proverbs and in the prophets, right? You think about Ezekiel 36, where it talks about having a softened heart, right? So circumcise your heart has to do with performing this procedure in a metaphorical sense, and as a figure of speech, right? In a metaphorical sense, you are cutting away portions of your heart that are keeping you from fully dedicating and devoting yourself to Yahweh, right? That's what the concept of circumcising your heart means. It means in the same way that the foreskin, that you cut away pieces of the foreskin, just to be blunt about it, in the same way you are cutting away pieces of your heart that are in this context, that are keeping you from fully devoting yourself and giving yourself to Yahweh, right? And it is a direct connection to that sign of the covenant, because it involves covenant, because it involves serving Yahweh with all your heart, with all your soul, keeping his commandments, keeping his statutes. In other words, obeying him. In other words, showing pistis in the Greek, faithfulness, dedication, emunah in the Hebrew, which is consistently translated as faithfulness. The word emunah in the Hebrew and the word pistis in the Greek go together. They're usually translated, at least in the New Testament, they usually in the Old Testament is translated consistently as faithfulness, and then the Greek, they always want to translate it as faith, but it really means more faithfulness. It really has the concept and the connotation more of loyalty, of dedication, and it involves obedience to Yahweh and to his word, which is very interesting because Paul consistently uses that concept in conjunction with covenant. It's whenever you have this tension that in the interpretation that traditional Christianity will give to the connection between works and faith, no such tension exists with Paul, because they go together. Right? So doing is a representation of the attitude that exists before it, which is exactly what's being described here in Deuteronomy 10. It's a love for Yahweh. It's a dedication, a loyalty, a faithfulness to Yahweh, which results in doing these things and these behaviors that are honoring to Almighty Yahweh. So far from being some kind of a legalistic viewpoint, what is being described there is a packaged whole, integrity, right? It's faith and obedience to Almighty Yahweh going together, which is what you're seeing here in Deuteronomy 10. In other words, it's circumcision of the heart. Okay, let's go over to Deuteronomy 30. We'll see it again. Moreover, Yahweh your Elohim will circumcise your heart. There it is again. Yahweh your Elohim will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants. For what purpose? To love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart. Here it is again. To have integrity, to be blameless, right? To love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and with all your soul, so that you may live. So there's no indication here that keeping Yahweh's word, that being obedient to him is wrong, is legalistic, this is all behavior, obedience that demonstrates faithfulness, right? So what's going on? Well, that's a topic for another day. Yahweh your Elohim will inflict all these curses on your enemies and on those who hate you, who persecuted you, and you shall again obey Yahweh, there it is, and observe all his commandments, which I command you today. Then Yahweh your Elohim will prosper you abundantly in all the work of your hand, and the offspring of your body, and in the offspring of your cattle, and in the produce of your ground. For Yahweh will again rejoice over you for good, just as he rejoiced over your fathers. If you obey Yahweh your Elohim to keep his commandments and the statutes which are written in this book of the law, if you turn to Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and soul, if you obey him, if you turn to Yahweh with all your heart and soul, what is the first part? That's obedience. That's Torah keeping, right? What's the second part? If you turn to Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and soul, that's attitude, that's faith, that's pistis, right? That's faithfulness, loyalty, emunah. And then he goes on describing how you can do that. So this concept here, Yahweh himself will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants. So there it is again, this concept of humility, serving Yahweh from the heart and cutting away anything that doesn't need to be there, right? And this is tied to what you see in Deuteronomy 6, 24 and 25. Deuteronomy 6:24. So Yahweh commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear Yahweh our Elohim for our good always. Notice that, for our good always, and for our survival as it is today. It will be righteousness for us if we are careful to observe all this commandment before Yahweh our Elohim, just as he commanded us, right? Just like it was righteousness for Abraham. So if you go over to Romans 4, verse 3, for what does the scripture say? Abraham, well, let's look at verse 1 for context. What then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, has found? For if Abraham was justified, and the word justified means declared righteous, for if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before Elohim. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed Elohim, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And that comes over from Genesis 15. And on it goes. Okay, so these are all extensions of this idea of circumcision being an inward condition, right? Circumcision represents an inward willingness to obey Almighty Yahweh, to believe in him, but also to demonstrate that belief through faithfulness in doing what he says. Now, as time went on, circumcision came to be viewed a little differently, right? And because of oral traditions, there are things that surrounded circumcision, particularly as regard to Gentiles and to non-Jews who perhaps wanted to join the faith, that became problematic. So let's fast forward thousands of years later, and let's go over to the book of Acts, Acts 15, and let's look at the problems that began to arise. So Acts 15:1, and the context, of course, is Yahshua has been resurrected by this point, started the assembly, and the early apostles, including Paul, are doing their thing, and then they start to have problems. Some men came down from Judea and began teaching the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. So let's look at that. Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. So they're using the concept of circumcision as a litmus test in order for individuals to have a certain standing before Almighty Yahweh. And I don't even remotely have time to go through all the different passages in Romans and Galatians on how Paul had serious objections to this. But the idea was that in Yahshua, we don't have this litmus test to prove that non-Jews have to do things in this way in order to be accepted to Almighty Yahweh, in order to have salvation. So what is this all about? Well, this is the case, once again, of custom coming into into play here and being implemented over and above what the word of Yahweh actually said. And if you don't understand these kind of things, you could be swayed by people who are trying to prove that the law doesn't have to be kept, because they're going to conflate things, right? They're going to take things that you see in Acts and things you see in Galatians and in Romans, and because on the surface they see one thing that really has nothing to do with the reality of what was happening in this situation, they're going to confuse things, and it can wind up being confusing to us as well. And a study like this is meant to help you to see what is actually happening here, so that you don't wind up having that type of confusion and being derailed in your faith. So this thing about unless you're circumcised according to the custom of Moses. So one of the first things I want you to notice here is this custom of Moses, this phrase. This is a term of art. What is a term of art? Well, this is something that is a very specific phrase. It's not just the simple words that you see there, a custom and then Moses, right? A custom that Moses promoted. No, this term custom of Moses actually refers to oral tradition. It's not Moses at all. It's oral tradition that arose around circumcision. Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. So the context that we're talking about here is for non-Jews, right? Well, Paul was making very clear that non-Jews did not have to be circumcised in order to be accepted as part of the faith, because ultimately the true circumcision was not the physical circumcision. Ultimately, the true circumcision was the circumcision of the heart. Where do you see that? Well, do you see that in some place like 1 Corinthians 7? So if you go down to verse 17, 1 Corinthians 7:17, and I'm bypassing all sorts of things, so just bear with me. I'm just trying to give you the heart of everything. Only as Yahweh has assigned to each one, as Elohim has called each, in this manner let him walk. What does he mean by that? He means if you came into the faith as a Jew, continue as a Jew. If you came into the faith as a Gentile, continue as a Gentile. Gentiles did not have to become Jews in order to become part of the faith. This is why whenever I see someone who is trying to force people to wear the tzitzit, or is trying to which is not even consistent with the way that the word of Yahweh describes it in Numbers and other places. When I see someone who's trying to force people to do certain things to be more Jewish, right? Then I say to myself, that person is in violation of the kind of things that Paul was describing here. Now, hear me carefully. I'm not saying that I'm talking about Torah here, right? Because Paul was certainly promoting a Judaic way of life, but he was not telling people you have to become a Jew in order to do it. And that's where a lot of this confusion arose, that people were, in the way of thinking of the first century, there were individuals in the assembly who wanted to force non-Jews to become Jews, to initiate them through a process of proselyte conversion to become Jews. And that was a no-no, because it was not necessary. Because what Yahweh promised to Abraham was that all nations through him and through his descendants would be blessed and would come to these, would essentially, in our parlance today, in our terminology today, would come to salvation. So for them to insist that every non-Jew had to become a Jew through an initiation ceremony, through rites of passage, if you will, culminating in circumcision and physical circumcision, was to essentially say Yahweh's way was not going to, that had happened through Yahshua the Messiah, was wrong. And Paul said later in the book of Galatians, he says that to do that is to deny what we have through Yahshua the Messiah. So let me go back to only as Yahweh, this is 1 Corinthians 7:17, as Yahweh has assigned to each one, as Elohim has called each, in this manner let him walk. And so I direct in all the assemblies. Was any man called when he was already circumcised? In other words, he was a Jew. He is not to become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? A Gentile, a non-Jew. He is not to be circumcised. Can't get any clearer than that. Circumcision is, and here's the key, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. And then the interpreter put in there, and I agree with that interpretation. But what matters is the keeping of the commandments of Yahweh. It's interesting that that's in a translation that is essentially promoted by Christian groups everywhere, and yet people don't follow that to its logical conclusion, because somehow there's verbal gymnastics that are done to wipe away the concept of the keeping of the commandments of Elohim. But that's a study for another day. But notice, circumcision is nothing. In other words, physical circumcision is the implication, is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. That is not what matters. That is not what counts. But what matters is the keeping of the commandments of Yahweh. Why? Because we already saw from Deuteronomy that the keeping of the commandments of Yahweh is an outward expression of something that already exists, right? Everything we saw there in Deuteronomy 10, in Deuteronomy 30, even in Genesis, right? Even in Exodus, is people who are committed, loyal, right? That word pistis, faithfulness, emunah. People who are loyal to behaving in ways that Yahweh wants them to behave, to embrace Yahweh's way of life. That is what matters. That is what leads. The circumcision is the final act when they do something to outwardly express what is already an inward condition, right? So circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandments of Yahweh, and the implication is everything, right? It's another way you could translate that. But if you notice that the italics are there, what matters does not appear in the text. So it says literally, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandments of Yahweh. And then the implication is everything. That's what matters. Each man must remain in the condition in which he was called, right? Let's go back to Acts 15. Actually, I have one other passage here before we go to Acts 15. Galatians, just a corroborating thing there from the book of Galatians itself. Galatians 6, verse 11. See with what large letters I'm writing to you with my own hand. Paul wants to make sure that they know that I'm writing this. No one else is writing this. Those who desire, because he was obviously getting flack from the same groups that the Philippians were, perhaps the same group or someone similar to them. Those who desire to make a good showing in the flesh, there it is again, right? They want to prove in the flesh that, we're Jews and the rest of you are not, right? Those who desire to make a good showing in the flesh try to compel you to be circumcised. This is the Acts 15 problem. They were plagued with this, right? And, in all fairness to them, we'll come back to this. In all fairness, they're just starting out, right? Well, not just starting out, because by the time that Galatians was written, we're talking probably around 51, 52, 53 Common Era, which would have been about 20 years after the assembly had begun. Because you figure if Yahshua died around 30, 31, 32, it would have been about 20 years later. So they've had at least a couple of decades, but all throughout that time, there's this conflict. There's this tension between Jew and Gentile and how to do things. But in fairness to them, they're still trying to figure it out, right? This is not easy stuff. So before we go and get all, overly critical, just understand that even today, we're having issues like this, right? So I guess we shouldn't be so hard on them. But it was not a good situation. So he says, see with what large letters I'm writing to you, those who desire to make a good showing in the flesh, try to compel you to be circumcised, simply so that they will not be persecuted for the cross of Messiah. For those who are circumcised do not even keep the law themselves, but they desire to have you circumcised so that they may boast in your flesh. But may it never be that I would boast except in the cross of our sovereign Yahshua Messiah, through which the world has been crucified to me and I to the world. For neither, here it is again, for neither is circumcision anything, nor uncircumcision, but what? A new creation. A new creation, right? And those who will walk by this rule, peace and mercy be upon them and upon the Israel of Elohim. A new creation that is reflected in the earlier chapters, yes? So he says, let me do it in, I want to say Ephesians. It says it a little bit more strongly in Ephesians. Ephesians 2, verse 11. Therefore, remember that formerly you, the Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands. Right? He keeps on emphasizing that. There's a flesh thing, and then there's the spiritual nature of it. Remember that you were at that time separate from Messiah. excluded from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without Yahweh in the world. But now, through circumcision? No. But now in Messiah Yahshua, you who were formerly far off have been brought near by your own blood through circumcision? No, by the blood of Messiah. For he himself is our peace, who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall. And I explained that there was actually a wall that had writing saying by the temple saying the Gentiles can come this far and no further, by abolishing in his flesh the enmity. And he goes on and he says that through Messiah we're reconciled, Jew and Gentile, reconciled to become something separate, right? And then he says down in verse 19, so then you are no longer strangers. You are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints. A new thing has occurred here. And does he mean that there's no longer actually a Jew and no longer a Gentile? No, because he says a little bit further down, right? He says that there's no Jew, Gentile, no male or female. Is he saying that there are no male and female? Of course there are male and female. Is he saying that there's no differences in races or differences in ethnicities? No, that's not what he's saying. He's saying that in the eyes of Yahweh, for salvation, there is none of that. Those categories are erased. Of course, there's still male and female. Of course, there's still Jew and Gentile. We're not talking about the physicality here. We're talking about the spiritual nature of salvation that is open to everyone, that it is a fulfillment of what Yahweh said to Abraham, that in him, all the nations, everyone would be blessed, right? So continuing to read here. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and are of Yahweh's household, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Messiah Yahshua himself being the cornerstone. He's the key to it all, in whom the whole building being fitted together is growing into a holy temple in Yahweh, in whom you also are being built together into a dwelling of Elohim, the Spirit. And this whole letter to the Galatians, to the Ephesians rather, is showing the obliteration of those differences between Jew and Gentile. Let's go back to Galatians 3:23. But before faith came, we were kept in custody under the law, which is not what you think it is, being shut up to the faith which was later to be revealed. Therefore, the law has become our tutor to lead us to Messiah, so that we may be justified, declared righteous by faith, right? And there's that word pistis. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor. For you are all sons of Yahweh through faith in Messiah Yahshua. You are all sons of Yahweh. Through what? Through circumcision, through faith in Messiah Yahshua. For all of you, and by the way, just in case you're not realizing it, the entire book of Galatians revolves around this doctrine of circumcision. The whole book of Galatians. And to make it seem something that is dealing with all of the Torah is a total misrepresentation of the book. For you are all sons of Elohim through faith in Messiah Yahshua. For all of you who are baptized into Messiah have clothed yourself with Messiah. There's neither Jew, this is the one. There's neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither slave nor free man. There's neither male nor female, for you are all one in Messiah Yahshua. And if you belong to Messiah, then you are Abraham's descendants, heirs according to promise. What promise? The promise in Genesis 12, the promise in Genesis 17. Okay, so let's go back to Acts 15 for a minute. So these men came over saying, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. So what had happened was that the oral traditions began to take effect, and the custom of Moses, this phrase here, is a description of these takanot, these customs, these traditions that were starting to take root in a much deeper way, where you invalidated the actual Torah with those customs and traditions. And I've described where Yahshua talks about them in terms of the hand washing ceremony. And you can see that Paul talks about them often, and he's often confused because people want to take those customs and they think that we're talking about the law of Moses in the Pentateuch, and we're not. This is why I'm pointing out here, this phrase, this custom of Moses, is not talking about the Pentateuch. It's talking about the way that the Jews were viewing Moses and using his name to promote the oral traditions, that what I call the takanot. Okay, so those traditions, they used Moses' name, and it was referred to, this phrase, as the custom of Moses. And there were ideas about circumcision that were being promoted that have nothing to do with the actual Torah that I read to you over in Genesis 17, but instead had to do with things that were added to the Torah that were presenting barriers to these individuals who were trying to join from among the non-Jews. Let me read you a couple of articles so that you can get some sense of how this idea was developing. So this is from an Encyclopedia Judaica article on circumcision. The promise that Abraham's seed should inherit the land of Canaan was bound up together with this covenant. That's what we read over in Genesis. The punishment for failure to observe this command was karat, to be cut off from one's kind. That's what the word karat means. Understood by the rabbis to mean excision at the hand of heaven from the community. This commandment is considered so important that the rabbis declared, this is from the oral tradition from Shabbat 137b, that were it not for, and listen, that were it not for the blood of the covenant, heaven and earth would not exist. Abraham was said to have circumcised himself on the 10th of Tishri. So already, you already see where this is going. There's all kinds of things that there's no mention of this in Torah, right? But it's the 10th of Tishri, right? Abraham was said to, and this is how it works in the oral tradition. So you start creating things out of thin air. And then you give it the force of law. Abraham was said to have circumcised himself on the 10th of Tishri, the day later celebrated as the Day of Atonement. Right? Where'd that come from? That's not in the scriptures. So, but when you create a tradition like that, then you do it to give credibility to it, and then people start to believe that it's actual law. The day later celebrated as the Day of Atonement, when the sins of the people are forgiven. Now, I want you to note that very carefully. It's important. What was the issue Paul was having? He was having an issue that they were saying that, well, let's look at it. Well, the problem, all of them, not just Paul, is elaborated more on Paul, but it says, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. So someone who doesn't look into these things more deeply thinks, oh, unless that these people were saying, unless you are circumcised according to the Torah, you can't be saved. That's not in the Torah. Where'd that come from? Well, let's keep going. Only circumcised males, this is directly from the article again. Let me go back. Abraham was said to have circumcised himself on the 10th of Tishri, the day later celebrated as a Day of Atonement, when the sins of the people are forgiven. There's a lot loaded into that statement. Abraham was said to have what? First of all, it says to have circumcised himself. Now, I'm reading a little bit into this article, but I'm telling you what the implication of that is. Abraham was said to have circumcised himself. So the first thing you know is that he circumcised himself, right? Which is probably true. But then they link it to the Day of Atonement, when the sins of the people are forgiven. The Day of Atonement, how are the sins of the people forgiven? The sins of the people are forgiven through the shedding of blood, right? So if Abraham circumcises himself, there's an implication here that somehow he's being responsible for his own salvation. That's problematic. In other words, when you do the circumcision, there's blood shed. There's a little bit of bloodshed in the act of circumcision, obviously, because you're cutting off, right? So the idea is that if I'm shedding blood for myself, that's the day on which sins of the people are forgiven. So therefore, my own blood, at least partly, my own blood is being used for the redemption, for my redemption, because my sins are being forgiven as a result of my own blood being shed. Do you see how that's a major problem? Okay, let's keep reading. Only circumcised males could partake of the Paschal sacrifice. In Hellenistic times, circumcision was widely neglected. According to the Book of Jubilees, many Jews who wanted to participate nude in the Greek games and the gymnasia underwent painful operations to obliterate the signs of circumcision. It's called epispasm. Nevertheless, they aroused the decision and scorn the derision. They arouse the derision and scorn of those whom they imitate. Yeah, of course, because if you try to be like you, again, if you try to assimilate, all it does is bring condemnation upon you. You neither serve Yahweh and you don't serve them either, because they see it for the inauthenticity that it is. Religious leaders at that time differed about the necessity for circumcision of proselytes. What is a proselyte? A proselyte is a convert. Religious leaders at that time differed about the necessity for circumcision of proselytes. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus required both circumcision and ritual immersion, that's baptism, for the admission of a proselyte, while Rabbi Yashua held that a proselyte needed only ritual immersion. And then there's a quote, there's a citation there. You see the confusion that exists and this back and forth debate about, well, is it baptism plus circumcision, or maybe it's just circumcision, or maybe it's just baptism without circumcision. And these are the kind of debates that go on with this oral tradition. With the rise of Messianic worship, it became a sign of difference between the adherents of the two religions. Well, that's not entirely accurate. Paul declared that justification by faith was sufficient for converts to Messianic worship, Romans 3:4, and this is a distortion. And in Justinian's Codex, surgeons were prohibited from performing the operation on Roman citizens who converted to Judaism. Should the child for any reason have been circumcised before the 8th day or have been born already circumcised, in other words, without foreskin, the ceremony of shedding the blood of the covenant, that's what it's called, the ceremony of shedding the blood of the covenant, chatafat dam berit, must be performed on the 8th day, provided it is a weekday and the child is fit. This is done by puncturing the skin of the glands with a scalpel or needle and allowing a drop of blood to exude. Do you hear what's being read there? So the ceremony to do the circumcision in oral tradition became known as shedding the blood of the covenant. Excuse me? Shedding the blood of the covenant. In other words, if the person's blood is shed, they are shedding the blood of the covenant. That is totally anti-scriptural. Totally. There's only one blood of the covenant, and that's done through the one who died for us, right? Which is Yahshua the Messiah. This is an article on from the Jewish Encyclopedia to get a little bit more on this. Jewish Encyclopedia article on circumcision. By the way, these are very old articles. In order to prevent the obliteration of the seal of the covenant on the flesh, as circumcision was henceforth called, the rabbis, probably after the war of Bar Kokhba, instituted the periyah, the laying bare of the glands, without which circumcision was declared to be of no value. According to Pirkei, Rabbi Eliezer, something or other, it was Shem who circumcised Abraham and Ishmael on the Day of Atonement. And the blood of the covenant then shed is ever before Yahweh on that day to serve as an atoning power. That's totally anti-scriptural. That's anti-Messiah is what it is. According to the same Midrash, Pharaoh prevented the Hebrew slaves from performing the rite, but when the Passover time came and brought them deliverance, they underwent circumcision and mingled the blood of the Paschal lamb, with that of the Abrahamic covenant, wherefore Elohim repeats the words, "In thy blood live." And on we could go, right? Down below, the rigorous view is echoed also in the Midrash. If thy sons accept my, and I'll read it the way it reads. If thy sons accept my Godhead by undergoing circumcision, I shall be their mighty one and bring them into the land. But if they do not observe my covenant in regard either to circumcision or to the Sabbath, they shall not enter the land of promise. The Sabbath keepers who are not circumcised are intruders and deserve punishment. And then it goes on with other things here. And it appears, however, that while the Palestinian Jews accepted the uncircumcised proselytes only as proselytes of the gate, non-Palestinian Judaism did not make such a distinction until the Roman wars, when the more rigorous view became prevalent elsewhere. And it goes on. But I want you to note that idea of the mingling of the Paschal lamb with the blood of the Abrahamic covenant. Where does that come from? It is a total distortion of anything having to do with the Paschal lamb, for one thing, and it involves the human being's blood to save themselves. So you could see why Paul would have issues with interpretations like this. And there's much more going on that I just don't have the time to go into. But let me just read a little bit more here in Acts 15. And when Paul, verse 2, and when Paul and Barnabas had great dissension and debate with them, the brethren determined that Paul and Barnabas and some others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders concerning this issue. Okay, I'm going to go down to verse 5. But some of the sect of the Pharisees who had believed stood up, saying, it is necessary to circumcise them and to direct them to observe the law of Moses. The apostles and the elders came together to look into this matter. After there had been much debate, Peter gets up. He tells them about his experience with the Gentiles. And then down in verse 12, all the people kept silent. They were listening to Barnabas and Paul as they were relating what signs and wonders Yahweh had done through them among the Gentiles. After they had stopped speaking, James answered, saying, brethren, listen to me. Simon has related how Elohim first concerned himself about taking from among the Gentiles a people for his name. With this, the words of the prophets agree, just as it is written. And he goes and he quotes from the prophets. Then he says in verse 19, therefore it is my judgment that we do not trouble those who are turning to Elohim from among the Gentiles, but that we write to them that they abstain from things contaminated by idols and from fornication and from what is strangled and from blood. For Moses from ancient generations has in every city those who preach him, since he is read in the synagogues every Sabbath. So the way I've traditionally always interpreted this is that there were certain things that if they wanted to have immediate fellowship with the Jews, because Gentiles didn't have a clue how to be Jews, right? They had to do certain things that involved abstaining from sexual immorality, abstaining from idols, and also maintaining the only interpretation of keeping from what is strangled and from blood. The only interpretation you can get to that is to observe the dietary laws, right? And it's kind of interesting to me because even people who agree with this, what I'm saying here, that the early believers were told to do these certain things, where did this not become necessary any longer? See, because I believe verse 21 is saying that the implication is Moses has people who are preaching him every Sabbath in the synagogues. In other words, as have them do these things, because this is going to be necessary to keep the peace between Jew and Gentile. But then over the course of time, since they meet every Sabbath and they're being taught, they're going to learn more and they're going to be able to incorporate these things into their lives. That's the way I interpret verse 21. But even if you don't buy that, how come people are not doing what verse 20 says and keeping from what is strangled and from blood and keeping the dietary laws? At least that. But that's a question for another day. And then they went out and they promoted these things. So it's important to understand when you see terms like the custom of Moses or the law of Moses, don't just take people's word for it that it's referring to the Pentateuch, or it's referring to the Torah. You got to look at those things and parse them and look at them in the context of what was going on in the first century, like the kind of things I was just reading to you. One more thing I'm going to mention to you, the time has flown. I wanted to cover so much more, but I'm not going to break this up into another study. But I do want to mention this, and perhaps I'll do an entire study on this another time. But I mentioned last week that there is a scholar that I'm looking more into his teachings these days, Dr. Mark Nanos, Nanos. He's a lecturer, I believe, currently at the University of Kansas. He's Jewish, and he is an expert in Paul. You know that I've been studying forever, for a long time now, N.T. Wright. Who is not Jewish, but he is also an expert on Paul, and I've gleaned quite a lot, and still I'm gleaning much from N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright, as I've explained in the past, is one person among many who is a proponent of a viewpoint on Paul that is steeped in the first century Jewish context of Paul and the apostles, and it's referred to collectively. The folks who espouse those theories are refer to it. They themselves probably don't refer to it as that, but others refer to them to it as the new perspective on Paul. Why new? Because the traditional views of Paul are what? He's a no law teacher, and free of the Torah and justification by faith, and all that, right? And the interesting thing is that the new perspective also ultimately comes to a similar conclusion, but for different reasons, and they have differences in understanding in the context of first century Jewish faith. So there are significant improvement in our understanding of the views of Paul as compared to the traditional views of Paul. But it's interesting because I didn't even know about these folks until recently, that Mark Nanos and those who have similar views, the ideas that they espouse, but they're referred to, and everyone has their own little categories and things among these scholars. These folks are referred to as those with the Paul within Judaism perspective, the Paul within Judaism perspective. And they actually come to different conclusions from the folks with the new perspective on Paul. And these folks tend to be a lot more steeped in the Jewish underpinnings of what Paul and those around him were teaching. So it's different. So I tell you all this to let you know that I'm studying more because I haven't done enough reading. I just bought a bunch of books to get more on this. But it's fascinating how Yahweh, in my opinion, has been opening the floodgates of scholarship and resources and things that are just absolutely blowing my mind. You know, the stuff with N.T. Wright has been blowing my mind for the last two years or so. And this stuff is blowing my mind as well. And I know that there's going to be controversy right between them, and some people are going to believe, and some people are going to say, no, that's not right, and whatever. You know, I've learned, and it's something that you should be aware of as well, that you're going to have, you know, you'll have 10 scholars, they're like economists. You'll have 10 scholars, and you'll have 12 different opinions, right? It's just the way, you know, from here until Yahshua returns, it's just the way things are going to be. But to me, Bible study is very much like putting together a puzzle, right? It's detective work in a sense. It's and there's so much material out there and so many clues that I feel that we're very blessed. It's a little bit overwhelming sometimes also, but I feel that we're very blessed to have that kind of information. But anyway, just want to share a couple of quick ideas and then we'll be done for today from Mark Nanos's material. And again, some of these things I agree with, some of these things I have to do more study, and other things I won't agree with because anyway, that's for another day. But let me just share an article here. This is something I came across while I was studying something else of his. Okay. This is an article, Reframing Paul's Opposition to Erga Namu as Rites of a Custom for Proselyte Conversion, completed by the Synecdoche Circumcision. Don't run away. Don't turn off your computers, okay? I promise you I'm gonna explain exactly what that means, all right? But whoops, because I almost wanted to run too when I first saw it, but I'm glad I did it. So what is this? Well, what is reframe? Well, reframing means that you're having a different viewpoint on something, right? Paul's opposition to erga namu. What is erga namu? Well, erga namu is this expression here. This is the expression that's normally translated as works of the law that you see in the book of Galatians and the book of Romans, in those two locations, okay? And that phrase erga namu is, in my opinion, and you have heard me say this before, it is key to understanding the book of Galatians, the book of Romans to a lesser degree, but mainly the book of Galatians, because that term, works of the law, to me carries so much weight in how people, when they, in their interpretation of that, how it influences their view of what Paul is saying about Judaism in particular, and about Gentiles as well. So if they have that wrong, they're going to have an awful lot else wrong as well. So for us to understand this term erga namu is going to be incredibly important. And you may recall during the Feast of Tabernacles that I was explaining to you possible, and I gave you the study, I think a further study when we came back. I was explaining, I did a whole study on works of the law, and I explained how there is a scroll that was found at the Dead Sea, is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls called 4QMMT. Remember that? And it has a similar expression, Maaseh HaTorah, that's a little bit different than, but it's the Hebrew equivalent, at least there's a parallel between that term, and I didn't give you the whole term, I think it's Miksat Maaseh HaTorah. And the word is, and the term in Greek is this erga namu. And my explanation of that Miksat Maaseh HaTorah is that the kind of uh, things written about that expression in 4QMMT, in that Dead Sea Scroll, parallels what Paul was describing because of the ritualistic nature of it. And it's interesting that Mark Nanos doesn't see it that way. He doesn't agree with that. He's heard that, and these scholars all work together. And he thinks that there are too many differences for there to be a connection between that. I'm not entirely convinced of that yet. But it's interesting, his take on erga namu. He believes that Paul actually made that term up in order to explain certain things with regard to circumcision. But going back to this title here is reframing Paul's opposition to erga namu. In other words, his opposition to the works of the law, but not in the way that traditionally people understand that, but rather as this understanding of the term erga namu as rites of a custom. And I'll explain that in a minute. As rites of a custom for proselyte conversion completed by the synecdoche circumcision. Synecdoche, big word, easy meaning. It's a figure of speech, and the term synecdoche means that you take the part of something and you make that part represent the whole thing. What does that mean? Well, it's easier to give you examples than to try to explain it in words and definitions. So if you say something like, it's an all hands meeting. Well, what does that mean? Are there no feet? Are there no shoulders? Right? No. Or you say, all hands on deck. Right? Well, you want more than the hands, right? You want the feet too, and you want the brain, presumably, and everything else. But the all hands represent the whole body, right? Or if you say something like, Washington is, no, you say the White House is doing thus and such. Well, you don't mean the building necessarily the White House, right? You mean it's representing all of government. Yes. Yeah. Bless the hands that prepare this food. Well, bless the hands. Yeah, and you would bring that one up, right? What about the feet? What about the shoulder, the ears, right? Yep. That's the synecdoche. Yeah. Yeah. There's, and I can give you many, many examples. I think you understand that. So what he's saying is that circumcision, remember I say, you got to understand the terminology that's being used. When Paul uses the term circumcision, he's not just using that in reference to the physical act of removing the foreskin, right? He's using circumcision as representative, as a synecdoche for the whole process of what he's objecting to, which is proselyte conversion, which makes total sense to me. Total sense. So what's interesting though, as I'm reading these things and I'm looking at some of the new scholarship out there, I'm saying, Father Yahweh, thank you for opening up our vistas, because there are things that we would not have been able to see before, that because we have resources and things available to us now, things are becoming so much clearer. And to me, that's no coincidence at this stage of history that we're starting to see those things. So let me just take you very quickly through this abstract, okay? And then I'll give you a couple of thoughts and then we'll be done. Just bear with me. And I think it'll be worth your time. So abstract, it's just kind of a summary of the whole, this is like a 40-page article. I got through about 10 pages and I couldn't go on before the study. In Galatians, Paul challenges some Messiah followers who are not circumcised, but interested in undertaking this rite, ergon, from the premise they have failed to recognize that according to Torah, they cannot do so because the commandment of circumcision applies to Jews and to non-Jew slaves acquired by Jews, and they are neither. So he's using the term Messiah followers because he doesn't like to use the term Christian, because he says at that time it's an anachronism, right? Anachronism is like if you're doing a movie about 1945 and you put something that you didn't see until 1980, that's an anachronism. It would look weird, right? So he's saying that Christian was not a term being used at that time. So he's just referring to them as in his term, Christ followers. I will just say Messiah followers. So in Galatians, Paul challenges some Messiah followers. And by the way, they are non-Jews. The audience of Galatians, remember, whenever I go over a book, I tell you history. I tell you Who is it addressed to? So all of that matters, because one of the reasons that Paul is so misunderstood and why all these wacky doctrines get taught is because they take him out of this context and they're not looking at all these different things, specifically that Paul was a Jew, a practicing Jew who was promoting Judaism as well. Paul challenges some Messiah followers who are not circumcised, non-Jews, but interested in undertaking this rite. Notice that he doesn't translate ergon nomu, and the plural erga nomu is the term usually translated as works of the law. But he translates the term erga, which is works, as right, from the premise that they have failed to recognize that according to Torah, they cannot do so because the commandment of circumcision applies to Jews and to non-Jew slaves acquired by Jews, and they are neither. Let me keep reading. Non-Jews who have already heard, in other words, faithfully obeyed the gospel, such as themselves, cannot undertake to become proselyte Jews, even if others may seek to influence them that they should or must do so to justify the gospel-based claim to have become sons of Abraham. In other words, translation, the issue that they were having in Galatians is that these same troublemakers who usually, were and troublemakers may be a strong term, but they were given problems, right? They were judging these people. They were trying to force them, is like the Acts 15 situation. They're trying to force them to get circumcised in order to be proselyte Jews. In other words, they're trying to get them not to just practice Jewish ways, but they're saying unless you become a converted proselyte, you cannot be saved, which is the same charge that was happening in Acts 15. As a matter of fact, people think that Galatians was the first book that Paul wrote and that he would have written it shortly after or maybe just before the Acts 15 conference. So we may be talking about the same people that are being described in Acts 15, right? So he's saying that Paul is challenging them to show them that they don't have to take that right. But let me keep reading. This essay challenges the received views, in other words, the traditional views of Paul's phrase ergonomu, usually works of the law, which is understood to indicate Paul's opposition to Torah or certain elements thereof. Instead, I propose that Paul's phrase denotes rites of a custom, specifically the customary rites involved in proselyte religio-ethnic initiation. In other words, big words, right? In other words, to convert to Judaism, to convert to become recognized as Jews in the religio-ethnic sense. In other words, he's not saying, he's not objecting, Paul is not objecting to them behaving as Jews. He's objecting to people trying to force them to become Jews. Kind of similar to some of the things that we've experienced in the present day when people think that if you don't wear the tzitzit, then you're not a true believer. I remember when I was in an organization dealing with that issue, that the people who were promoting that essentially were saying that if men in particular did not wear the fringes, the tzitzit, that they were not being obedient to Yahweh, and therefore they were not, essentially, to use the language that Paul would use, that they were not true Jews. So you were going to use that, in that case, the tzitzit, as the litmus test in order to prove your Jewishness. As a matter of fact, we said, we proved to them, the other side of the issue, including me, said, you are, in trying to get people to do that, you're missing the spiritual aspects of that, which is not meant to be taken in a literal sense, because it's the spirit of Yahweh that helps you to remember the Torah. You don't have to do it in a physical sense anymore. And even when you did have to, it wasn't done the way that you're describing it. It was done another way. And then they kept saying that they agreed with us, but the phrase kept coming out of their mouth. But so we'll be okay with people not wearing them for now and just allowing anyone who wants to wear them to do so. But eventually, and I forgot the exact terminology, but it was something like, but eventually we're going to expect everybody to do it. So, and we kept stopping and saying, what do you mean? So I'm not getting you. You're saying that you understand our point about this not being a literal physical requirement, and that there's a greater spiritual principle behind this, much like circumcision of the heart, is the ultimate spiritual principle, but we're still going to require them to wear the fringes anyway, you see. Because if you don't wear the fringes, then you are in disobedience to Yahweh. And see, no, you can't have it both ways. Either you believe that it's a symbolic thing that's represented by this physical thing that no longer has to be done anymore. There is no continuation of that sentence. There is no, but in other words, their implication was that, well, we're going to let them slide for a bit while they get used to the idea, and then eventually we're going to require them to do it. And we said, no, it's either it's a symbolic thing or it isn't. And we're not getting through. And ultimately, we had to agree to disagree and to part ways because we weren't going to accede to that. At least I wasn't going to. So I wound up leaving, mainly on the basis of that issue, not only, but mainly because of that issue. But Paul's situation was not tzitzit, it was circumcision. That if you're not being circumcised, you are not part of this assembly. And Paul's saying, no, that's not what Yahweh promised to Abraham. He didn't promise him that circumcision was going to be the litmus test. He promised him that through your obedience, through your love of Yahweh, through your faithfulness, he was going to make you bless all the nations through you. And then Paul gives the tie-in with Romans 4, right? With Genesis 15 and Romans 4 going together, that we're declared righteous through Yahshua the Messiah, who is the vehicle by which Yahweh brought these things to pass, the way he brought the true meaning of the Torah, including circumcision, into play. So you don't need Yahshua and circumcision, the physical act of circumcision. You just need Yahshua. And he was trying to ward off these wolves who were trying to put their salvation into question and their acceptance as part of the body of Messiah into question through this foolishness. So I propose instead that Paul's phrase denotes rites of a custom. What custom? Rites of a custom of proselytizing. And that and the meaning of ergon namu absolutely supports that in the grammars and the lexicons, absolutely supports that, and the context of Paul's writings absolutely supports that he's not referring to, when he says namu in this context, he's not referring to the Torah at all. He's referring to a specific custom that is tied with these rites, these rituals of this custom of proselytization. I'm saying it wrong probably, of proselytizing, of conversion to being Jews. And that's what's very clearly being described in Acts 15 and in other places. And then circumcision is not just circumcision itself, but it's circumcision and other proselytizing. The whole oh my goodness, I can't say the word. The whole process of conversion, let's just say. So circumcision is a synecdoche here, describing circumcision and everything else associated with that process. What Paul opposed, continuing to read, was circumcision and the related initiation rites, not Torah, which he puts into tension with pistis, faithfulness, in their case. In other words, these initiation rites, not the Torah. Paul argues from Torah, and that's an interesting thing too. Have you ever thought about that? That for a guy who really, in effect, hated Torah, presumably, he sure uses Torah an awful lot to prove his points, including in Galatians, right? Over in Galatians 4, just a couple of chapters down from the very verses that people use to say that Paul was opposed to Torah, he goes to Genesis and he gives the example of Hagar and Sarah. So for someone who really hated Torah, you figure he might have done better going to Roman sources or going to Greek sources and going to philosophy or whatever it is, instead of going directly to Torah to get his examples. But that's not what Paul did, is it? Anyway, Paul argues from Torah that the custom at issue, that these non-Jews undertake proselyte transformation and thus adult male circumcision, is not enjoined in Torah, and it isn't. In the allegory of chapter 4, the one I just referred to, of Hagar and Sarah, he identifies the custom of proselyte conversion instead with the model for incorporating slaves by adults of circumcision. This custom of promoting proselyte conversion therefore disobeys Torah, which he argues in chapter 3 invokes a curse instead of the blessing supposed. So what does everyone say? They look at Genesis 3 and, oh, the Torah is a curse. And they use the passages that are described there to call the Torah a curse. Are you kidding me? The law that David calls a law of freedom, and that it was was given for freedom and is described in glowing terms in Deuteronomy 10 and 30 and everywhere else, you're going to call that a curse? Are you out of your mind? But that's what people do. This custom of promoting proselyte conversion, therefore, disobeys Torah, which he argues in chapter 3 invokes a curse instead of the blessings imposed. Why? Because again, you're considering that salvation is by human means rather than through Messiah. So in effect, what you've done is you've become anti-Messiah by saying I must become a literal religio-ethnic Jew in order to be recognized as a son of Abraham. By doing that, you deny Messiah. It's just, the irony is unbelievable when you consider the full ramifications, because there are people today, there are groups out there that they want to force you to wear the kippah, they want to force you to wear the tzitzit and everything, and in their minds, that is the way that you show the evidence that you show that you're a Jew. Well, I say that the evidence that you show that you're a Jew is by your obedience to Almighty Yahweh, by your willingness and your faithfulness to serve him and to serve his people and to serve all of humanity, because we are supposed to be the ones who are promoting the kingdom of Yahweh as ambassadors. And you don't do that by an exclusivist mentality. By the way, if anyone wants to wear a kippah and they want to wear tzitzit, more power to you. Go ahead. If it makes you feel good, wonderful. The problem I have is not that you do that. The problem I have is when people use that as a litmus test for other people and their faithfulness. There, I put a full stop and I say, you need to walk away, because you're just perpetuating what these people did in the first century, and you're not going to do that. So the implications, just to finish up, the implications for reading Paul and extrapolating biblically based warrants for or against circumcision are many, with more than a few challenges to the prevailing Pauline discourses about this topic. In other words, he's challenging the traditional views. Finally, in keeping with the interests of the conference that he was in, I offer and this means an interpretational, hermeneutical reflection on circumcision for later Christian males apart for that qualification. And then there are 40 following pages that describe all that in great detail. So I hope that wasn't too confusing for you, but I want you to see, I really want you, as I present these things, I want you to be encouraged by it, right? I want you to see that there's so much scholarship out there, so much from which we can draw to better understand these things. And I'm going to keep studying as long as Yahweh allows me, gives me the strength. I'm going to keep studying and bringing things out here and there in sermons and messages and studies. And I just want to encourage you, because I think we're going to have a much better understanding of the scriptures. And, and if there are things that I run across that I find that I missed something or I misinterpreted something, I don't have a problem saying so, right? So I will never, perpetuate an error with you so that I can, keep from, so I could save face. I want to learn. I want to keep on learning these things and becoming more, understanding. And I want to continue to develop our maturity with regard to these things.